adequately. If we move to the next page, the first section we see after the introduction briefly explains the situation that exists that requires a choice to be made between navigation systems for Penn State's websites. If you read the introduction more thoroughly, some context was placed there, and while this section goes into more detail, it only needs to go into as much as necessary to remind its audience groups of the situation and to place them within context of it. As we will find out later, all three audience groups for this report are fairly familiar with the context here, and so this first section is on the brief side compared to what some of you may need to write for your own audience groups. If we move toward the bottom of the page, we begin to see that in addition to the first level headings at work in the report, there are second level ones at work here as well. We can also notice that, as with the web page navigation heading title, all the heading titles on this page are rather informative and therefore much more usable for the reader than the generic heading titles such as Situation or Alternatives would be. We can also see that there is a textual intro that gives a cohesive forecast to the second level headings that follow in the drop-down navigation versus sidebar navigation sections. And it actually says drop-down navigation and sidebar navigation, which is the next. As we move through this second section, we notice that the writer here is incorporating visuals within each of these sections that illustrate what type of navigation system they are describing in the subsections. At an initial glance, I do wonder why there is more text included under the first navigation system than the second, and I suspect that if I were reviewing this in a workshop, I might take a closer look at it to see whether information was missing from the second section, or if some material was placed in between these two section descriptions that needs to be moved after the sidebar navigation section to finish up this main section because it discusses things relevant to both navigation systems. Of course, I would also look at that as an instructor when assessing this report. Okay, the next section in this report is labeled criteria. We can see from this section intro that the writer is using this section to describe the criteria she or he will use to compare and contrast the two different alternatives that she or he is analyzing in the report to address the situation that exists that they have been asked to analyze and make a recommendation about. If you notice, the introduction is cohesive and forecasts the second level heading titles that follow in the order that they follow. Starting with usability, we see that there are three main criteria categories this writer will use in the analysis of each alternative. We also notice through the usability section textual intro that the writer is breaking this particular criteria category into subcategories and examining each one through a third level heading section. If we scroll through the full range of third level heading sections under usability, we can see that the writer is creating definitions for each category that he or she will use to evaluate the alternatives. The writer is utilizing a parallel textual structure within each of these sections as well. Very good. As an instructor, I might suggest that the writer consider utilizing a visual table, however, to represent these various categories more effectively in the criteria subsection and perhaps even in the criteria main sections. A parallel table with third level categories or second level categories represented in vertical columns, one perhaps with the category title, such as effectiveness, efficiency, learnability, memorability, and a second adjacent column section, for example, that would contain the definition of the first term or category. Okay, we go back through the rest of them. We see that the last two criteria sections remain standing on their own. Okay, they don't go into subsections, which is okay. To step back and look at this alongside of those of you watching this video and examining this report sample for the first time, it is worth noticing that so far the writer has done what all of you will do in your reports, and that is, 1, the writer has set up a description of the situation that needs to be analyzed. In this case, in this section, web page navigation, and a little bit prefaced in the introduction. 2, the writer has presented and described alternatives that will be considered to enhance or resolve the situation. Here we have drop-down navigation versus sidebar navigation. These represent the alternatives here in play. And then 3, the writer has defined the criteria that will be used to evaluate, analyze, and compare and contrast each one of those alternatives in order to recommend one or the other, which was the last section we finished looking at. The next section, comparison of alternatives, is where most of the analysis part of your report will take place. This is the section in your reports where you will compare and contrast the alternatives against the criteria and against one another in order to recommend one over the other. If we look at the intro in this section, and then again at the subsections here, we do see that the writer does trim down the introductions in these sections and relies instead upon a reference to the previous criteria sections as mentioned above in the report. So here we have, in this section, each alternative will be evaluated and compared starting with the drop-down navigation and then the sidebar navigation based on the criteria mentioned above. So that's kind of like cheating. I would imagine the writer probably argues a case in the cover memo for battling redundancy. At least I hope the writer does something to recognize the shortcut taken here. But it would take much convincing to get me past the scenario where a reader would enter the alternatives section without previously reading the criteria section and still be able to enter the text as successfully at this juncture through that introduction. That, and the writer is setting up an extensive parallel structure throughout an extensive section here. You see how long this section is? That basically needs to cover 2 complete main section sets of 3 heading levels each. And if they are only doing so one time, the 3 additional sentences, they would need to introduce these sections and make them fully cohesive seem to be a very small price to pay for such usability insurance. Well, enough on that though. This writer is usually meticulous about cohesion, as we'll see in the proposal document. So I really do believe the choice here about this introduction was a true choice and not laziness or anything like that. I do disagree with it though, but this is a good example of how if the writer had made an argument or their approach in the introduction in the cover memo, as an instructor, I would look at that differently depending upon what the writer wrote to me about. And although I still would disagree with the writer's choice, depending upon the rationale and the rhetorical situation, I probably would not assess it as harshly because of the valid thinking that went into the choice. In any event, you can see that the writer creates a perfectly parallel structure here to discuss each alternative. So if you go through drop down navigation, it goes through usability and then all the subcategories. And then it goes to the second criteria category, design implementation, third, user experience, and then go into sidebar, goes through usability and all the subcategories, and goes through design implementation and user experience.